Hello, welcome to this online open day. My name is Sonia Tucci. I work in the Department of Psychology at the University of Liverpool, and today I'm going to talk to why do we eat so much and gain weight. So to start with, I'm going to show you the energy balance equation, which is quite simple. So the energy balance depends on the intake, which in turn depends on your hunger, your satiety, which means when you feel full, and also the absorption of nutrients. The expenditure is the energy we spend, and the expenditure depends on the metabolic rate, which is the amount of energy that we use to keep our bodies going. So it's the energy that keeps your heart beating, our digestion, our temperature, and anything on top of that is the activity. So the metabolic rate would be between 1,500 to 2,000 calories. It depends on your body weight and it depends on your thyroid and your age. And anything on top of that would be your activity, which is the amount of exercise that you do and your general moving throughout the day. If the intake is more than the expenditure, the excess of energy will be stored in animals. It's stored in the form of fat, and if the intake is less than the expenditure, then the individual will end up losing weight. Now, this system has a very high accuracy because if you take into account the amount of calories we eat in a year on average is about 900,000 calories, and 1 pound is about 4,000 calories. So if you eat an excess of 11 calories a day, you will end up gaining 1 pound in a year. Or if you don't eat the 11 calories a day that you need, you will end up losing this pound in a year. So considering that the error is quite small and we eat so varied amount of food and our activity changes in a year, the system seems to work really well because we tend to keep our body weight relatively stable despite the fact that our activity changes and our intake changes from day to day. Just as information, 1 kilogram of fat contains 9,500 calories. This means that if you want to burn 1 kilogram of fat, you need to not eat 9,500 calories. And if you want to put on a 1 kilo, it means you've eaten an excess or you haven't burned 9,500 calories. This accuracy of the system has been proven because in studies, when they look at how people keep the weight or gain weight, they found that, for example, in this 5-year study in adult women, found that most women either gained weight about 2.5 kilos in 5 years or maintained the weight. For half of them, 40% of them maintained weight. Now, gaining 2.5 kilos in 5 years means 0.5 kilograms per year. And again, this translates into a 10 calorie a day overconsumption. That is nothing if you think about it, because a biscuit like that would have about 500 calories. So only a tiny crumb of that biscuit in excess every day would lead you to gain about a pound a year. Now, why do we have this? Why do we like food? Why do we eat in excess? A lot of it can be explained by genetics. So the genetics influences our body weight because our brain and the way our brain evolved determines the amount of food and the food that we like. Now, evolution only works at a very slow pace. So we can't make big changes in our brains in terms of genetics in a few generations. And to explain this or to illustrate this, I put this graph or this figure that shows that our ancestor, Homo erectus, which is an earlier ancestor, evolved about 70,000 generations ago. This is about 2 million years ago. And in between Homo erectus and our species, Homo sapiens, there were still other species of men, which ended up having evolved into Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens, which is our species, evolved about 200,000 years ago. So if you went back 200,000 years ago, a human at that time would have been exactly the same as a human now. This is about 7,000 generations ago. This is important to understand because in terms of our biological design, in terms of the design of our brains evolved and worked very well in the last 7,000 generations. Now, these 7,000 generations happened in its huge majority in Stone Age conditions. And this is because civilization only started 10,000 years ago. So of the 200,000 years, 190,000 years, we lived in Stone Age conditions. And we have managed very well because we are the descendants of those people. So the brains worked really well to survive in Stone Age conditions. So this is very important to remember. The brain has not evolved to be able to survive during civilization, during the last 500 generation, and not the last 5 generation where really modern life has kicked in. So this is a fact that we have to keep in mind when we try to explain the behaviors that we have and the factors that in terms of food our brain prefers. So going back to this, you say, well, genetics can influence body weight. The brain hasn't changed really in the last generation, but what has changed dramatically is the obesity figures. So there's a huge increase in obesity in the last generations. It's going up by the day. And this basically, if you think about it, has to be the consequence of a big change in the environment and not a big change in genetics. So the environment at the moment is what is called the obesogenic environment. So it's an environment that promotes obesity. Why is this? Because through civilization and through modern life, we have created foods that are energy dense, so they have lots of calories, foods that we really, really like. So we have a lot of food that we like, and it's food that is easily accessible. And also, we do not have to do the amount of physical activity that our ancestors had to do. So at the moment, some people hardly do any activity during the day, whether in the past, the people had to work to get their food. So why this obesogenic environment has made us fat? Because our brains have a high preference for fat. If you look at these pictures, you can see the celeries and the carrots have a very low content of fat, and the foods on the right have a very high content. So if you ask the majority of people what they would prefer, the majority of people would prefer the foods that have a high content of fat. Now, why is this? This is not a fact that happened by chance. It's because in the past, where we evolved, food wasn't readily available. So if you found food high in fat, you had to have as much as you could because you didn't know when your next meal was going to happen. So individuals that had a high preference, and by this I mean individuals that liked food high in fat, had a bigger chance to survive and breed. People that didn't like fat, didn't eat the fat, and then they didn't get enough calories, so they were more likely to not make it, really, not to breed. So we are the children of humans that had high preference for fats. And that is a survival advantage if we think about the conditions where we evolved. Because in the past, foods weren't readily available. Humans had to go and hunt for the food, as animals do now. When they got the food, they had to eat as much as they could because they didn't know when the next meal was going to happen. So we, as children of those humans, have inherited those preferences. And because those were the conditions when the brain evolved, and in the last 190,000 years of Stone Age conditions, the last years wouldn't have a big impact on our preferences for food, even if now having the preference for those types of food is harmful for our health. So if you look at people that do gain weight, obviously they have a higher preference for foods high in fat and usually sweet foods than lean people. And obviously the food that people prefer, if you ask people and you get people to choose from pictures or from real food, you ask people why they prefer, most people would prefer food that have a high amount of fat in them. So humans tend to have a high preference. We tend to like foods that have a high content of fat in them. Why fat? Because fat carries twice the energy than proteins and carbohydrates. So if you eat fat, you basically eat half the amount to get the same calories that you would need from carbohydrates or protein. And you can see here, it's very interesting that alcohol also has a higher amount of calories per gram. So basically, a combination of environmental and individual genetics seems to determine your body weight. So what are the key environmental factors? There's 3 of them. One is the availability of easily accessible food. The second one is that the food itself is different, so it's more energy dense. And finally is that the levels of activity are low, so we don't work for food. I'm going to talk a bit more about each one of them. So the first of it is the availability of an excessive amount of easily accessible food, which is new. Again, if we go to the past, we come from ancestors that were hunter and gatherers, so they had to work to get food. So in order to go and get an animal, you had to expend energy. You had to use energy. You had to follow the animal. Then they had to prepare the animal, and that in itself required energy. So it wasn't an easy task. Even after agriculture started, the food you get through agriculture were quite simple. And most humans, up to maybe Industrial Revolution or even before the war, most humans had only access to very basic food. So foods that had high sugar, high fats, like nuts and cakes and honey, were only available to people in very high social status, like kings and queens. But normal people that didn't have any money in the past, they didn't have access to those types of food. After Industrial Revolution, mass production of food started, packaging started, and we now have supermarkets. So at the moment, the majority of us would have access to a supermarket where you can find food that is accessible to most people. So what people had to do after supermarkets were invented and mass production of food were is just walk to the supermarkets or get in their cars, get a trolley, walk around the aisles, and get the food they wanted. And most food was easily accessible for most people. This evolved to another type of food, which is the ready meals. So in most developed countries, you have ready meals, so you don't even have to buy the ingredients anymore. You just buy a meal, put it in your trolley, go home, put it in the microwave and eat it, so you don't have to add ingredients and choose what you're going to put on them. This has evolved to another newer aspect, which is the delivery of food. So at the moment, if you don't even have to go to supermarket to get your food. You just go on your computer, choose what you want, and it gets delivered to your door, and then you make your food. But don't even have to make your food anymore, because now you have ready meals. You have takeaway food, so you go online, look at what you want to eat, which probably is going to be something nice and tasty, which probably will have a high amount of fat and carbohydrates in it, and then get it delivered to your door all ready to eat. So basically, from having to go and hunt your food, we have been put in a position where we just have to go on our phones without moving and order a meal, which probably would have a lot more calories than a meal you had to hunt in the past. This not only has happened to humans. If you expose animals to the same environment as we have exposed ourselves, you can see that pets would become very obese. So there is an epidemic of obese dogs, obese cats, rats. Again, if you give rats diets high in fat and carbohydrates, they would become overweight. And obviously children also, if they're exposed to those foods and they're allowed to eat as much as they want of those foods, they will tend to become overweight. And this is what is happening at the moment. So there's a problem of obesity from early childhood throughout all our lives. The second aspect is that the food in itself is different. So the food available now has more energy per weight. So let's say in the past, again, if you had to go and hunt for an animal, a gram of animal product would have less calorie than a gram, for example, of a processed food, for instance, like chocolate or a fried food. This food as well, modern food, has a low content of fiber. So fiber is what makes you feel full, and also fiber, most of it is not digested. So basically it fills you up without giving you any calories. At the moment, the foods that we would order, or the foods that are available, lots of them have very low fiber. Because they have very low fiber, they also become easier to chew, and we tend to like that. So we don't like foods that you have to chew a lot. So in the competition between, let's say, a vegetable and a ready-made meal, usually the ready-made meal would win. Why? Because in general it's cheaper. If you get, for example, in this case, for £1, you get 2 chicken Kievs, you can feed a family. A broccoli, for a pound of broccoli, you're not gonna feed the family. It's easier to prepare. You just stick them in the microwave. To make a pound of broccoli nice, you would have to work a lot more, because you have to add probably oils and cheese or something. So if you don't want the bother, it's easier to prepare, and it's much more likely that the family is gonna like the ready meal. So it's nicer, and also will be much easier to chew. So the poor broccoli has no chance against the chicken Kiev. Obviously, I'm only talking about the properties of the meal and not the education that people have and the knowledge that they have that they need to eat the broccoli. In that case, that goes to individual differences, and you would eat the broccoli because you know the broccoli is healthier. But if you only talk about taste, price, ease to prepare, and ease to chew, the garlic Kiev is going to win. All these qualities will make the food more rewarding. So in general, foods that are easier to prepare, if they're cheaper, they're tastier, and they're easy to chew, in general, they're more rewarding. So you would be more encouraged to have them again. So what does reward mean? Well, reward means that when you like something, you get a sensation of enjoyment, which is produced by your brain, and it encourages to repeat that act again. So in terms of food, the brain wants you to eat foods high in fat because of the evolutionary reasons I explained. So when you eat something that is high in fat, your brain tells you this is nice. So you perceive the food as nice, meaning that you would want to eat this food again, or you would want to eat more of that food at the time. So you end up eating more. But the problem is that not just you want to eat more, but by eating a lot of this tasty food, that changes your reward system. So your reward system becomes even more reactive to those foods high in calorie. And this is not just proved in humans, is also proved in animals. So if you feed, for example, rats on a diet containing 25% sugar, so like a very sweet solution, the rats like sugar, so you give them the solution every day, and then one day you don't give them, the rats got into a state of confusion and anxiety. So basically the rats going into a state of withdrawal. like they would do with drugs. And this happens to us as well. So if you used to eat sweets, for example, or nice tasty foods every day, the day you don't have them, you also would be thrown into a state of anxiety and you would want to get those foods. So you go and buy more of those foods. Usually this happens with foods that are high in fats. It's very rarely that you would have that withdrawal effect with foods that are low in fat, like vegetables, like carrots, for instance. In humans also, they have done studies, and with imaging, they're relatively easy to do. In this study, they looked at the brain reward areas in subjects while they were having a sip of a solution with different amount of fats. So in this case, they used like a milky solution and they were increasing the amount of fat in the solution. So let's say if you go for a skimmed milk, which has only 1% of fat, and then they increase to, let's say, semi-skimmed and then full fat. Full fat has about 4% of fat. Then single cream has got 18, double cream 40%. And individuals were having a sip of it. They were rating how much they liked it. And they, at the same time, they were looking at the brain imaging, and they found that the reward areas were more active with the highest amount of fat. So basically, the high amount of fat in double cream would be perceived as nicer, obviously, in individuals that do drink milk than the skimmed milk. Now, if you look at these foods, going about the environment and how foods have changed, what do these foods have in common? So if you look at them, obviously not all of you will like them, because if you are vegetarian, you wouldn't like some of them. But in general, most of these foods, we will like most of them. And also, they're not available in nature. This is very important. So going back to evolution, we have a brain that has not evolved in the presence of these foods. So they are relatively new. They manufactured foods. And according to most of us, some of them at least would be yummy. So if we look at them, we would probably like some of them. As you can see, there's a combination of sweet and savory foods here. This is very important because you say, well, how can we not have a set point for them? Why can't we stop eating them? Why, we don't have a set point for those foods? We can eat a lot of those foods. Again, because they don't exist in nature. So we do have a set point for fats on their own. We have a set point for carbohydrates and protein. So if we eat fat on their own, so let's say we're going to eat just fat, like oil or butter, you don't like it to start with, you wouldn't binge on fat only. Carbohydrates is the same. Just sugar is nice, but it's not as nice. And very quickly you get full. You don't like it. You don't want anymore. And the same with proteins. You only will eat a certain amount and then your brain said you had enough. So we can stop when we had enough. But and this is exactly the same in rats. So if you give a rat free amount of foods that are available in their diet, they would eat just the right amount and they would not put on weight. But if you give them foods high in fat and combined with carbohydrates, they would not stop eating and they would gain weight. And the same happens with humans. Why is this? Because it seems that there's no set point for the combination of carbohydrates and fat. Why is that? Because, as I said, those foods do not exist in nature. So if you think about foods available in nature, there's no foods that have the combination. And what we really, really like is the combination. So if you think about savory food, the fat would be, let's say, lard. We don't like it. The carbohydrate on its own, we won't like it either. Let's say a potato. But if you combine the potato, which is the carbohydrate, with oil and make a chip, that becomes really nice. And it's the same for sweet. So the sweet sugar we don't like. The fat only, we like butter, we don't like. But if you combine and make a nice donut, then we like it. But because there is no set point, we won't stop eating. So basically, they only go on the reward system. The brain is telling you have more because you really like it, and there is no set point. So that is a really dangerous combination that explains why people can gain so much weight eating those types of food. So basically, when exposed to these types of food, the brain behaves exactly the same as the brain when it's exposed to drugs of addiction. Even more bad news. Food now, it's easy to chew. So the food industry obviously want to sell us food, as much food as they want. We don't tend to like foods that we don't like to chew. So we don't like a liquid diet. We won't go happily having just milkshakes, but we like food that is just barely chewable. So what we really like is foods that have just enough chew, just a little bit of chew, but not too much. And that's what those foods are, the ones that we like a lot more. So this type of food where we just have to chew them once or twice and disappears down our throats overrides the body signals that tell us I'm full. Why? Because again, the brain evolved with food that had to be chewed. So if you chew your vegetables, like your salad and your tomatoes, it takes longer and the brain tells you you had enough, stop eating. But if this food goes really to your stomach very, very quickly, there is no time really for the signals to adapt until you've had enough. So this food, you can have a lot more before you signals reach your brain and say you had enough. So when you chop your ingredients, for example, roughly, it requires time of energy to chew, and we don't tend to like that. So if you soften them, you put a high-fat dressing and chopped really, really small, then we like them more, and we tend to eat a lot more because it overrides those signals. So again, if we go back to evolution, you think about the foods we had, those foods did not exist in the environment we evolved. So again, the brain and the body wouldn't know how to cope with them, and there's no set point for those foods that are easy to chew. So when you eat those easy to chew things, which are probably snacks, you can have 500, 600, 1,000 calories before you know, because basically there's no effort in having them. They slip down your throat and they don't give you a sense of being well fed. So the brain doesn't say you had enough food. There's no signal that say, please stop eating. So food disappears very quickly and they just leave us wanting more because there's no signal on one hand. On the other hand, there's no set point. And on the other hand, they only work on the reward system. So we really, really want that food. We really like that food, but there is nothing telling us you've had enough. And that's what actually happens. When they look at how many times, for example, people chewed in the past, it was about 25 times before it was swallowed. Now the average is about 10 times. So it's gone down dramatically. And the last bit is activity. So that again is working against us because the levels of daily activity are low and we don't have to work for food anymore. And that goes hand to hand with increase of obesity. So if you look at the increase of obesity, it's matched by the rise in car use. So we don't walk anymore, we don't cycle anymore, and also TV viewing. So of course, if we're watching TV, we're not exercising. So the amount of activity we have in these modern times is considerably lower than the amount of activity we had in the past. Apart from these big two factors, there's other factors like people now smoke a bit less and nicotine suppresses appetite. So by reducing smoking, weight tends to go up. Nicotine also increases the production of heat. So by not having nicotine, we're using less calories to make heat. It's also known that people that sleep less, and we sleep less now, that stimulates overeating. Also the use of heating. Now we all have heating, so we're not exposed to cold anymore. So that also reduces the amount of energy we spend. And finally, there's also evidence that individuals that have a high body mass index, so individuals that are overweight, have an increased potential to reproduce, meaning that people with high BMI would have more children with probably the same tendencies to gain weight. Now, for the majority of women, there's even more bad news. So when they look at women and the way they gain weight, the women tend to gain weight over the years, and just to keep the increase within 5 pounds, it's not even to stop it. Women must start with a healthy weight and do 1 hour of moderate physical activity each day. That will stop them gaining over 5 pounds over 13 years in that study. If the woman starts heavier, they tend to gain more pounds, even if they do those two, well, even if they do the exercise. So thank you very much. I hope I gave you some interesting information, and see you online if you have any questions. Bye.